Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Miami Presents, a conversation with Jeff Pegues, class of 1992. Tonight, we do have Jeff Pegues with us, and he will be joined by Dr. Howard KLEIMAN from Miami's Media and Culture area of the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film. So we will have a program lasting about 1 hour tonight. It will be recorded and available soon after the event ends. The Miami University Alumni Association is really proud to bring this type of programming to our alumni and friends. And if this is your first time joining us, please be sure to check out our past virtual events on our website, and you can watch any of those at your leisure. You'll be able to submit questions tonight during our webinar. There is a button underneath this the video feed to submit a question, and we'll be relaying those at about a 20-minute midpoint mark, and then again at the end. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Howard and Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff, and it's been my pleasure to know Jeff for, I don't want to embarrass you, Jeff, for about almost 30 years. Actually, it is about 30 years. And one of the great joys of doing the job that I had the privilege of doing at Miami for 37 years is watching students just bloom, to find themselves, to become the best possible people they can be, and then to see their careers, see their personal lives just flourish. And I've had that opportunity to see Jeff, through his career at a lot of different points, watching him as he cut his teeth in local news and got to the point where he was working in cities like Miami and Baltimore with another Miami alum producing on his station, and then in the biggest market in the country in New York City for the ABC-owned station there. And then lately, in the last, 7 years, right, Jeff? Mm-hmm. Being at CBS News, and now for a while having been appointed their head of the Justice and Homeland Security beat, and watching him just do incredible reporting at the national level. And this is after, as a local reporter, he was doing things like active shooter events and Hurricane Sandy and terrorist attacks and presidential elections. And I'm sure there were some happy stories in there too, but obviously the most challenging stories. And that's what he continues to do for CBS. And along with his reporting at CBS and really integrated into that, he's written 2 books of significance in the last 4 years, and we'll touch on them during the hour. Compromat, How Russian Undermined American Democracy, looked at Putin and Putin's hackers and how they futzed around. I think that's the legal term, Jeff, right? Futz, with the 2016 election. His book, Black and Blue, Inside the Divide Between Police and the Black Community, obviously couldn't be more timely. It was timely when it was written a few years ago. Sadly, it continues to be timely as it talks about the very fraught relationship between people of color and local law enforcement. Jeff was part of a team 3 years ago at CBS that won an Edward R. Murrow Award. And as I said at the beginning, it's just been a joy to watch Jeff's career. He also, I will say personally, because I helped create our Inside Washington program, and Jeff has been an extraordinary friend to the program. He is, every semester we've asked him to speak, he's always spoken with the students. He's always been able to get us into CBS's Face the Nation and meet with whoever was the anchor of that show. And, that's on his off time on Sundays. So Jeff's time with students has just been extraordinary. So with that, Jeff, let me get it rolling. As Michelle said, we'll have some questions, and then we'll give Michelle a chance to ask some of the questions that the audience may be thinking about. So I mentioned Compromat, and you looked at the 2016 election. Obviously, you identified the some of the mischief that the Russians were involved in. It's only, I know, obviously 2 weeks past the 2020 election, but what do we know, if anything, about whether it's Russian interference or any kind of foreign interference with this cycle? Are you aware that there was anything comparable or at all like what happened in 2016?
I think the jury is still out on that. And I say that because, even in 2016, we didn't really find out how intrusive these Russian hackers were until, I don't know, weeks, months after these incidents occurred. So I think the jury's still out on that. But what we can say is that U.S. officials, not the president, but U.S. officials, especially those whose job it was to secure the election, they believe that this was the most secure election in U.S. history. But the guy who put out that statement and made that assertion, he was fired. I think it was the day before yesterday. I don't know. Every day is longer these days in Washington. But he was fired because the president didn't appreciate what he said, the fact that he said that this was the most secure election in U.S. history. And so, I think they, post 2016, Howard, they did a really good job, I think it's fair to say, of securing the election, in that they worked with the states across the country. And as you know, the election system across this country is, it's not one. In other words, there are different systems in each and every state and the different municipalities. But what they were able to do was share information, share best practices. DHS did a good job of scanning these data centers where the election information voter databases are kept. And that was really a step up from 2016 and the years before that. So there was a lot of coordination. And then there was also this effort to move to backup paper ballots, which in 2016, that was an issue in some states that didn't, or local municipalities that didn't have paper backups. So you would register your vote, but if something happened with the machines, there would be no record of it. And so given what happened in 2016, there was really an effort post 2016 to make sure that wasn't a problem again. There are still some states, I think about 5 or 7, that don't have these paper backups. But the bottom line is the election was much more secure, based on my experience, based on my research, based on the people that I talked to, than it was in 2016.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears a little bit, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has been a real flashpoint in the administration since he took that job. And there are, people who love him, and there are people who say that he spent more time really being the president's attorney than being the chief law enforcement officer of the country. What's your take? I mean, Barr obviously, like this administration overall, is a lame duck. How would you characterize his time as Attorney General?
Pretty controversial.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. I do not think that history will be kind to Bill Barr, because if you look at some of the most controversial things that he's done, the things that really caught our attention is that they all related to the president's friends or associates. Roger Stone, for example, Michael Flynn. And so he did things that typically an attorney general would not do. A lot of people talk about the relationship between Eric Holder and President Obama, but whether you criticize that relationship or not, Barr has crossed some lines that we have not seen crossed in this country. But it's also symptomatic of this period that we've been going through over the last 3 years with the Trump administration. And I don't know if it's because President Trump came from the private sector, did not have a government job, really hadn't spent a lot of time in Washington before he was elected president. Perhaps If you give him the benefit of the doubt, he doesn't know how things are supposed to work. And yeah, I know that people hired him to drain the swamp, but there are some standards that should be maintained when you're living in a democracy. And you have to have this separation of powers. And when it comes to law enforcement, you have to have, this justice system that is fair. And when you have people like Roger Stone and Michael Flynn getting these breaks from the Attorney General, and then you have prosecutors within the Department of Justice quitting in protest, that's not normal. That's not normal. And the problem is, going forward, if it becomes the norm, that's what concerns me. Based on what I know, Howard, about Michael Flynn, for example, there is no doubt in my mind that he committed a crime. Covering his story from the beginning, we knew that he'd had these conversations with the Russian ambassador. We knew that he lied about it. We knew that he also had some shady dealings with Turkish operators while he was in the White House. We knew that he had this sketchy background when he was working in the Obama administration at the Defense Department. So he crossed all sorts of lines. And, I consider myself a law and order person. What he did, in my view, was jeopardize this country's national security. And it was a crime. And so to see the Justice Department under Bill Barr's leadership intervene in that case, that was a real slap in the face for justice in this country.
Staying with DOJ, and again, it's early, but you've probably seen, and I've seen at least the beginnings of some thoughts about who the next AG will be, who Biden will appoint. Any thoughts about or anybody that you can see that would be a particularly good fit as the next Attorney General?
We hear about Sally Yates. I was talking about Michael Flynn, and Sally Yates was the acting Attorney General at the time, Deputy Attorney General in the Obama administration, who went to the Trump White House and said, hey, you have a problem. You have a problem with Michael Flynn. She tried to warn the administration about Michael Flynn, and of course they ignored her. So she is someone that could get some consideration. She taped some sort of message during the DNC, which to me suggests that she's interested in that job at the very least. You also have Deval Patrick, who served in the Justice Department in the past and recently had a short-lived campaign for president. And I think there's a dark horse. I don't know if she's going to get the nod, but she could be a good pick. Vanita Gupta, who was the former head of the Civil Rights Division during the Obama administration. And I bring up her name because obviously you have all these social justice issues and the relations between police and community. So she could be someone that at least gets some consideration. Also, Doug Jones, the outgoing senator from Alabama. People are talking about him, which surprised me, but he's also a former prosecutor.
Putting on your Homeland Security hat, there are observers who say one of the problems that came from the delay in 2000, as we sorted out who was going to be president in December, was it delayed the transition, and it created, in some people's minds, somewhat of a national security vacuum that, again, there's a thought that maybe the 9/11 planners were able to take advantage of. There are people who have said this is a problem or can be a problem with what's going on in 2020, that we're delaying the transition, obviously, and the people who do not wish us well as a country are going to be smart enough to see that there is a distraction that they might be able to take advantage of. What's your take on that? Do you think that's a real problem, and is it imaginable that could create, obviously not necessarily another 9/11, but something that could be utilized by our enemies?
I think it's a problem. For many reasons. I would argue that there are more threats now out there than there were before 9/11 in that transition. You have hackers that can shut down infrastructure, make the lights go off in your neighborhood if they want to cause some sort of chaos. You still have the threat from terrorists, both internationally as well as domestic. So there are several major concerns around the globe where you need to have, in my view, a seamless transition. And what we're seeing now is anything but. I just don't see a winner in this, and that's what's so distressing. Listen, we knew, and I think you and I talked about this before, we knew that if President Trump lost the election, it was going to be difficult to get him to leave quietly. That was my greatest concern as someone who focuses on national security post-election. Would some of these groups be stirred up, wanting to cause chaos because he's upset? So this transition, it is creating this void in leadership and raising questions about the next president's leadership that will have lasting damage on this country. But it's also, it is also damaging, in my view, President Trump's legacy. I think history will not look kindly on this transition. This was, unlike 2000, this was not a close election. It was not close. And even if the Trump administration wins some of these lawsuits, which they've lost most of them, except for maybe one, I think, it's still virtually impossible, I think, for them to legitimately claim that President Trump won this election. The vote total is still rising. Joe Biden has a 5 million plus vote lead, 306 electoral votes. It's over. It's over. So right now, all the president is doing is riling up his supporters, creating more division. And that's a problem not only for national security, but it's a problem for each and every American. And that's what concerns me.
Let me follow up on that, and then Michelle, I know, is going to have some questions from the audience. I mentioned that the delay in transition, it's argued, might have helped foster 9/11, that it might be a problem here. But when I asked it, I was, really thinking of external, enemies. What about the internal, the people, the Michigan militias and the Proud Boys and what have you? Some people say, oh, it's a bunch of, weekend warriors playing with guns. And other people say, these people are serious, and that was not a joke what they were planning to do with Governor Whitmer. And again, what's your sense of the domestic threats that have certainly, if not been directly encouraged by the president have certainly been at least indirectly, encouraged by the president.
Well, and I lump the international and the domestic together. Why? Because the FBI right now, they're investigating as many internationally linked terrorists as domestic terrorists. They have what they tell us is almost an equal amount of investigations into domestic terrorists. But it's an issue that people don't really talk about as much as they probably should. These are white supremacist or anti-government types. They just don't like the police. These are typically white people who maybe they're part of a militia, but they're usually anti-government or white supremacists. And that is where law enforcement right now has its hands full. Why? Because perhaps they didn't prepare for this growing threat. And it has been growing over the last 8 to 10 years. Even during the Obama administration, it started to really become an issue where people in the Department of Homeland Security were coming to reporters like myself and saying, DHS has taken its eye off the ball. These domestic terrorist white supremacist group are a real problem. But nobody cares because they're so focused on extremists overseas. And what we've seen over the last several years is that, these hate crimes are rising. You have this militia activity kicking up, and you have public officials making statements, riling people up. So when I look at the threats that the incoming president will face, that's what I think about. No, not only the international, but also the domestic. People forget about Timothy McVeigh. I think people forget about that. That happened in Oklahoma City. So there is a lot on the plate. And that's why these presidential daily briefings, the president is supposed to get, it's a thick packet of information. Sometimes it's delivered orally. Sometimes it's in a book fashion. But this president hasn't really paid attention to those PDBs. But typically it is something that a president should be taking a look at and hearing about every single day. Because you have most presidents say that the primary responsibility of their job is to keep the American people safe. And as voters, we need to ask, well, what are you doing to do that each and every day while you're on this job?
Michelle, you want to throw some questions in from the audience?
I'd be happy to do that. So thank you, Howard, and thank you, Jeff. Before we jump into a few questions, I'd like to mention that tonight's event has drawn alumni and friends from the class of 1955 all the way through the class of 2020. So Miamians of all ages definitely share that love of learning. And speaking of a love of learning, Jeff was kind enough to join us, the Miami Alumni Association, a couple of years ago for our winter college educational program. And Penny and Tom Perlis, who met you there, asked me to say hello.
Tell them I said hi.
Oh, they're watching with us tonight. So our first question from Melissa Salazzo, class of 92. Will you, Jeff, share your reflections on the 2020 election and how history may look back on the past 4 years?
Oh, that's a really good question. Let me start with the good. I think, I really think, and this has all been overshadowed by the last couple of weeks, but I really think you have to give it to President Trump for the way he campaigned down the stretch. Again, this is something else people almost forget because there's so much happening day to day, but he did have COVID-19. And then in the final stretches of the campaign, he's out there, and obviously you can criticize him for holding those rallies and putting people around him in danger. But this sounds ridiculous, I know, but if you take all of that out of it, his energy, his passion, or his supporters, you really have to give him credit for that. And the fact that he still got 71 million plus votes, that's incredible. That's incredible. And which leads me to another issue. Well, what does that say about this country? Because if you look back at the last 4 years, as a person of color, if I take my journalist hat off, he's done a lot of things and said a lot of things that offend people like me. And, from a law enforcement perspective, if you will, while he claims that he supports law enforcement and the unions, they love him. Rank and file, they love him. But then in the next breath, he's saying, hey, AG Barr, can you make sure Roger Stone beats this rap? Or, hey, can you help out Michael Flynn? He's undermining the laws that law enforcement is sworn to uphold. And I'm just thinking, well, if you support law enforcement, why don't you support them in that way? This is a country, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, and I'm real old-fashioned about that, and that's why I wrote that first book and second book. I care about the laws of this country, because if we don't have consistency in how laws are upheld, then that's not a democracy. If we have Russians or Iranians or the Chinese or the North Koreans poking their noses into this democracy, that's not America. And I don't believe I'm taking any sides when I put it that way as a journalist. I care about this democracy that gives me the freedom of speech to do the job that I do. I think the media, that's why the media is important. The reason I got into this job or got into this career is because I think it is important that we hold all public officials accountable. Not just Republicans, but Democrats as well. And I believe you will see that in the next 4 years. It is important because that's what this democracy is all about. And so to get back to the question, I think there's going to be some real tough scrutiny on this administration because of some of the policies, because of some of the inconsistencies in the policies, because of some of the rhetoric, and then because of this transition. No matter where you stand, this undermines the democracy. This is going to make every transition going forward harder. And it shouldn't be this way. No matter who you support, it should not be this way. And of course, the president will say, well, they did this to me in 2016. And that's not true. That's not true. He tends to focus on the Russia investigation, and the fact of the matter is, if his campaign manager and if his national security advisor, as well as others, did not have these sort of shady dealings with Russian operatives, for example, Manafort actually handing over information to his former assistant who was a Russian operative, there would not have been that scrutiny going in. If the Russians hadn't then hacked the DNC, and then the president from the campaign trail saying, hey, Russia, if you're listening, do some more hacking, there would not have been that scrutiny. And there would not have been people who said, well, had questions about the legitimacy of his president. That was a self-inflicted wound. And there were many more self-inflicted wounds over the last 4 years. The firing of Jim Comey, self-inflicted wound. And I can't go through the list because it would take a whole hour and a half to do that. So history is going to be tough on this president.
So speaking of Russia, I have a question from Neil Williams, class of 70. Do you feel that the media mislabeled what Russia did in the 2016 election as interference, implying direct action, as opposed to what it seems they did, which was exacerbating and inflaming divisions on social, racial, and other issues?
Very good question, man. Our viewers have very good questions. I think, I'm going to say it again. I've been saying it. That Russia story, as told by CBS News, New York Times, NBC, it's accurate. I think once the smoke clears, and I think, frankly, I think that's part of the problem here with this transition. I think once the smoke clears, the truth is going to come out in a clear and unobstructed fashion, because that was something else that Bill Barr did. When Mueller finished his investigation, Bill Barr did such a good job of spinning, of framing how that report was received, that people thought, oh, the president didn't do anything wrong. But if you read deeper, and that's part of the problem with all of us today, is that we tend to look at the headline and we don't read beyond. And I think they knew that that would happen. You see all the different connections. You see all of the obstruction in getting to those connections. You see that there was activity that should not have been happening. And here's why I know that it's true. Because sadly, last year, gosh, I'm looking back, the president did the same thing or tried to do the same thing with Ukraine. Those are facts. Those are facts. Why would you go through what the president went through with the Russia investigation and then try to do the exact same thing with a different country? Okay, that's what I don't get as a reporter covering this administration, is that why do you keep shooting yourself in the foot? I had FBI guys telling me, who frankly support the president, telling me, yeah, I've never seen a guy shoot himself in the foot as much as he does. So I think we framed, the Russia stories, it's complicated. There's so many different levels to it. Yeah, there is the hacking and the influence operations, very important. Because as I point out in my book, and this was the reason why I wrote my book, they don't have to change how we actually vote in the voting booth. All they have to do is get in our heads. Okay, and that's how they influence how we vote. And that's the big danger. And they know that. And that's why now Iran is doing it, North Korea and China to varying degrees. But I think what you will see, and even the Democrats, from what I'm hearing now, even the Democrats don't want to go down this road. But what you will see is the real truth come out about Russia in the next year. You will see the truth come out. And then people will be, they'll just say, oh, wow, so it was true. So that was a good question. And obviously you can tell I'm passionate about it still.
Well, your passion certainly fuels your work. So I have one more question for this break, and then we'll let the two of you get back to your conversation. We have so many good questions coming in and lots of comments, and I wish I could relay them all, but we would be here till midnight, I think. So here's one from someone from the class of 22. So it's exciting to know that we have current students watching with us tonight. So Caroline Hobbenstricker asks, how have national security issues in America changed over the years while you've been at CBS, especially what you've seen through your reporting and research? And how have you adapted to any changes that you've seen in that area?
Another good question. How has it changed? I think there are more threats than ever before. And typically at the beginning of the year, the top intel, they didn't do it this year because they didn't want to upset President Trump. But typically the top intel officials, FBI, CIA, NSA, they go before Congress and they outline the threats, the threat landscape, and the information that they gather in these documents, and that they're made public. There are more threats in that book now, and they'll say this, than ever before. And it's true. Just people think about how the world has changed just in the last 30 years since I've known Howard. Okay, when I was in Miami, we didn't have cell phones. We had, people had beepers, which was a little device. Typically you put it on your waist and it'll beep when somebody's trying to reach you. But we didn't have computers. My first job, I was using a typewriter. And then I'd get in some old beat up Chevy station wagon and take this big camera thing because I was working alone. I was the type of reporter who I had to shoot my own video and write the story and then edit the story. We call those one-man bands. And then, I was driving from Rockford, Illinois, up into southern Wisconsin, which at the time, frankly, was known to be a hotbed of KKK activity. In fact, you recall that Geraldo Rivera got into maybe you recall, those of us who are old enough will recall that Geraldo Rivera got into a fight with, a group in that area that I was covering. And I remember having to stop at the payphone to call into the station. So that was the 90s. Okay, so the world has changed a great deal. And, I bring that up because the world is more interconnected than ever before, not only in business, but also as it relates to the threats that this country is facing. People don't think about that. But as I said earlier, these threats can come in so many different forms. They can get into your home. That's something that we've never imagined through your computer. That's something we never imagined 30 years ago. And so the national security landscape has changed a great deal.
Jeff, one of the things I forgot to mention in introducing you is your experience as a student athlete at Miami. Jeff was a flanker on a Miami football team in the early 90s and number 6, right?
Ooh,
I think. Yeah, look at the things I remember. Yeah. And so I want to touch on athletics and what's going on in the world. Athletes speaking out on social issues isn't a new thing. I mean, those of us who are old enough remember John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the '68 Olympics in Mexico City on the stand after they won or finished in the medal with the arm extended, right, to make a comment with the black glove. And it's continued. Certainly Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who spoke in Miami a couple of years ago, has passionately addressed social, racial issues. And then everything seemed to move up a notch with Colin Kaepernick 4 years ago. And a lot has obviously been written about Kaepernick's, the reaction to Kaepernick and what he stood for. But certainly in the last year or so, I mean, it's become even more prevalent. You see the branding now on uniforms and on stadia whether it's a Black Lives Matter slogan or an equality slogan on a football helmet. I went to Illinois, and I think the Illini players are wearing helmets that have equality on them. Doesn't make them play better, but it's certainly a good thought. There are people who say, and certainly there have been people who have said athletes need to stay in their lane. You know, they are great athletes. Being a great ball player or a sprinter or what have you doesn't give you any great insight to speak out. And other people say, no, of course you should take advantage of the spotlight. And if you have, you know, a following, then you have a responsibility to that following to address, you know, issues that are important. So with all of that, what's your feeling, both as a former athlete and just as somebody who watches and cares about and reports on social justice issues? How do you see the role of both pro athletes and college athletes speaking out on the issues?
Well, you went through the chronology of of how, you know, athletes have been outspoken in the past. But in the past, the difference is they were punished for it. Oh, Smith and Carlos, they were ostracized. Muhammad Ali, he got punished. Kaepernick, punished. You know, so Kaepernick was perhaps a turning point, only because, you know, several years after he was essentially banished from the league, he was still out there making public statements. And then President Trump came along, and the rhetoric increased. And then you have these athletes who aren't just athletes anymore. I mean, these are icons, a lot of them. LeBron James, you know, and then they have social media, for example, that amplifies their voices. And so the conditions have changed. You know, and then not only do they have that, but they can say whatever they want. Why? Because they're gazillionaires. They don't care. LeBron James has more power than the most powerful owner in the NBA, I think. And we've seen that because when they said they weren't going to play after George Floyd, they didn't play. And had they wanted to drag that out longer, they could have done it. You know, so these athletes have more power, more money, more influence than ever before to make a change in the communities that they come from. And that's not a bad thing. I don't see that as a bad thing. Not all of them are speaking with one voice. You know, during the NBA bubble, you saw that there were some players who didn't kneel. Some stood. And so that is a good thing to see, frankly, and that's why I'm so encouraged about the future generations, because they are aware of what's going on around them. And that's important. They are aware of their voices. I was so impressed with the young people through this election who walked around, whether they were Republican or Democrat, with vote on their shirts. I think it's great. That's what this country, in my view, is all about. If you don't like how things are going, make a change. How do you make a change? You vote. That's the power that you have. And I think the fact that athletes are getting involved, that brings more people into the process. And it's something that I think has changed dramatically over the last 4 years and will continue to evolve. But either way, it's good to have their input on these issues. And, you know, people talk about, you know, there's all this focus on basketball and football, sports that have predominantly Black athletes. Well, if you watch golf, and I watch a lot of golf, they send a different message. Golf is a conservative sport. they send a different message. So they're not as outspoken on issues like social justice. There are a few golfers who've made a statement in their clothing, but that sport's a little different. I still like watching golf, but they're using their sport in a different way, and that's okay too. These athletes have more power than they've ever had before.
Obviously, a lot of what the athletes have addressed has been social justice issues, often triggered by an incident in the community involving police and people of color. So I want to take you back to your book, Black and Blue, and obviously the fraught relationship between law enforcement and the community. So much of what happens in the community, by definition, is a local issue. What, if you're Joe Biden or you're in the Biden administration or an advisor to Biden, what can happen in Washington that can really affect what is essentially a local issue, which is that relationship between law enforcement and the people in that community?
I think because the issue is so big in this country, you have to have federal leadership. And that's going to be a real challenge for President-elect Biden. He'll get a pass on it for the first couple of months, perhaps. I don't even know if it'll be that long. But, there are people in the Black community who want this issue dealt with now. Nothing has been solved since George Floyd's murder. You still have this civil unrest. And somebody's going to have to step up and say, hey, let's essentially broker a peace deal. How do we bring both sides together? Now, President Obama, post-Ferguson, post-Baltimore, he tried to do it at the White House, and that's what my first book is about. And I'm not peddling my books. I'm just saying. That's what the first book was about, because there were meetings in the White House. And President Obama brought together community activists and the law enforcement leadership. And they put them in the White House, and they were actually hashing out these issues. And President Obama was criticized by law enforcement during those meetings. It was, from my sources, what they tell me is that it was tough medicine for him to swallow, because he was being criticized because of some of the statements he was making that law enforcement viewed supported the community and not police. Police felt like he didn't have their back. But at the end of those meetings, what you saw in police departments across the country, you saw a movement toward building better relationships with people in the community. George Floyd's murder set that back. And the other issue we've seen over the last 6 months or so, whatever it's been, is that you have the White House only talking to law enforcement, only supporting law enforcement. And you can't solve this problem that way. You have to, bring people into the room, bring both sides together, and hash it out. And, you can call me naive, but part of my job over the last 30 years in this business is covering people on both sides. I've covered the activists. I've covered the cops at the local level. I forget how many different local markets, and you went through them, that I worked in. But one of the benefits of that is that you get to meet some really fine police officers. So anyone who says to me that, all cops are bad, immediately I tell them, no, that's not true. You cannot generalize like that. You can't paint them all with the same brush. It's not true. I know a lot of good police officers. I know a lot of good FBI agents. I know a lot of good DEA agents. These are people who, they didn't get into that work to get rich. They got into that work to help their communities. And on the other side, I've met a lot of people in these communities, and I've been a part of these communities where, they're just trying to live their lives. They're just trying to make ends meet. And here's the problem when you have bad cops on a force. You can, they make an arrest on trumped up charges, throw a father in jail. That father who's been thrown in jail on some bogus charges, he loses his job. So the family doesn't have any way to pay their bills. It creates this cycle of poverty, all because you have a bad cop throwing somebody in jail for something they didn't do. That's why it's important. You talk about poverty in these neighborhoods. Well, it's all a cycle. It's more than just getting beat up every day or harassed every day in these communities. It's about survival. If you're stopped on a bogus charge, it can change your life and your family's life. There was a story like that in Baltimore that I'll never forget. This guy was stopped and it was a bogus charge, and they created evidence on the body cameras. They actually recreated the stop or the evidence on the body camera. And that wasn't determined until later. Meanwhile, the guy is behind bars, losing his job. Can you imagine anyone who's watching this, if for some reason you're thrown in jail, you haven't had your day in court, it's a bogus charge and everybody knows it, but you're stuck in jail. Daddy's not coming home. You can't pay bills. It's a cycle. It's a terrible cycle. And that's another reason why these issues are so important to the daily lives of white and black Americans across this country, people of color across this country. Everybody is affected by this. This is the justice system of this country. These issues have to be fixed. And the only way to fix it is if you get both sides together.
Michelle has some more questions from the audience. Michelle?
Thank you. So the first question we'll go to is from Patrick McLean, class of 87. How can members of the media move forward the conversation about whether systemic racism exists in America?
We have to keep talking about it. We have to keep using examples that I just talked about. Like the one I just talked about. I think people are becoming aware, all people. And that is a good thing. I remember the morning that the George Floyd story became a thing. I woke up that morning, it was early, I think it was like 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was looking at my phone and my emails, and one of our producers sent out the email showing the video. And there was no other discussion around the video, and it had just been sitting out there for a little while. And I said, this is incredible. I couldn't believe what I was watching at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I sent out a note and I said, this is unusual. This should not have happened this way. And to their credit, my managers in New York, immediately said, Jeff, do you want to go? And this was during the pandemic, obviously. Do you want to go to Minneapolis? And I said, yeah, I need to go. So I did a quick report on the morning show and then jumped on a plane to Minneapolis and was in Minneapolis for about a month, covering that story nonstop. But I bring that up because when I hit the ground in Minneapolis and I got to the scene there where he died, I saw more white people than black people. And, having lived in Minneapolis, I know it's a progressive city. When I was there in the mid-90s, they had a black female mayor. So I knew it was a progressive city. But typically at protests like that on the first day, you do not see all those white faces mixed in with the black faces. There were more white people there for that protest on that first day than there were black people. And I tried to relay that information to my producers, and I think they were as surprised in New York as I was. But what that says is that people are becoming more in tune to these issues that, frankly, the black community has been complaining about for decades. For decades. Other people who don't look like me are seeing this, and they're just as outraged as anybody else because they know this country is better than that. And, you know, a lot of people don't know that. I mean, I spent the first 13 years of my life living in several countries in Africa. I lived in Paris. My father was a banker for Citibank, the World Bank, the IMF. So I grew up a foreigner. So I know what it's like to live in other places. One of the places was Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Ivory Coast. And anyone who's familiar with that region of the world, you know, they've had troubled history, a lot of corruption. So I know what it's like in other places. And when you see what happened to George Floyd, you know, that doesn't happen. That should not be happening in this country. And certainly not in 2020. And so it is good that, in my view, the media more than ever is digging into these social justice issues. These are issues that affect more than just Black Americans and people of color. You know, these are issues that put police officers' lives in danger. And if you support the police, think about that. This makes their job tougher. If the communities they go to don't like them, it makes their job tougher. You know, so when you're speaking out against Black Lives Matter because you support blue lives, well, just think about it that way. Think about the fact that if you have a police officer or someone in law enforcement that you care about, why not try to make their job easier? You know, so it's important that, and that's part of my, you know, what I've been assigned these days. That's a big part of what I do, are these social justice stories. But I think they're important. I think, you know, 20 or something years when I retire from this business, that will be what I'm remembered for, because it's important to me. I mean, my parents grew up in Montgomery and Birmingham, Alabama. They marched with Dr. King. My father was heavily involved in the protest movement. My mother was too, my family. So it's something that I grew up with, which is another reason why I'm, you know, to toot my own horn, and which is another reason why I wrote the book. Because of my history covering police and my history covering social justice issues, I think I have a perspective that other people don't have. And I think right now, this perspective is important because this is something that affects each and every community.
So, Jeff, that's a perfect segue. It's almost like you're a professional or something. This is a tough one, a tough question to relay, or maybe not, but Joe Fisher, class of 83, shared a couple of comments that he disagrees with some of your perspectives politically, and he inquired about your thoughts on remaining impartial in your reporting. And as we mentioned earlier, you're passionate about your work and about the stories you cover. So I'll ask the question, do you often encounter pushback on the stories you cover and how you choose to report those stories?
Yeah, which is one reason why I try to stay off Twitter. I think everybody has an opinion. And that's fine. That's America. But I think if you go back and fact check everything that I said, I didn't say anything that wasn't a fact. you might think is an opinion because it doesn't line up with what you think. But, I've talked to Michael Cohen. I've talked to Roger Stone. And I got to say, I tell everybody this. I enjoy talking to those guys. They are hilarious, for one. They're a lot of fun. And so I've talked to these people. I've talked to James Comey. Back in New York, I used to, I talked to President Trump. He was with Sarah Palin one day walking through the streets of New York. They were coming out of a pizza shop. And at that point, I was in local news in New York at the #1 station. And as you know, he watches a lot of TV. And he said he stopped along this line and there were dozens of reporters there. And he just singled me out for some reason. He said, I like your work. I liked President Trump when I was growing up in Connecticut. Why? Because he brought the New Jersey Generals to the Meadowlands, Doug Flutie and Herschel Walker. I try whatever I do in this business. We have, first of all, you should know, anything that we do on TV goes through several levels of fact checks. What I say doesn't just appear on TV. It's like having an English professor at Miami and your paper is getting graded and they're crossing lines out and saying, well, shouldn't you have said this? So it goes through a tremendous amount of vetting. But and I think more than a lot of organizations these days, we stick to the facts. And there is nothing that I said in the last couple of hours or hour that is not factual. And I've tried to be as fair as possible now, just because one might not like the conclusion that the Mueller team came to, which if you read it, the whole thing, you'll see what's in there. You might not like that, but this stuff happened. Just because someone says it didn't happen, read it for yourself. All right? If you don't believe me, don't just go read it. Sit down on a Saturday and read through that. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but if you have questions about guilt or innocence, read that. Okay, if you think Michael Flynn should be cleared, read what he did. Are you kidding me? Before he was even charged in 2017, before he even took office, I had CIA sources saying, we're really concerned about turning over, briefing them. There was no investigation then, but everybody knew the kinds of contacts that they were making and the things that they were doing behind the scenes. Not everybody, the public didn't know that, but we knew it. And that's what the sources were saying. We're not making this stuff up. As much as they want you to believe that it didn't happen, it happened. And Michael Flynn and President Trump even tried to warn, President Obama tried to warn President Trump not to hire Michael Flynn. Why? Because there's a history there. People knew that Michael Flynn had these really shady contacts within the Russian government. So if you think that's all made up, if you think Roger Stone didn't do it, he did those things. I guarantee you over a beer, he'd probably admit it. In fact, I had an interview with him, with Roger Stone, before he became a household name, where he lied to me. I brought him back and I said, well, you said this, but now we have videos showing that you had information about these Russian emails. Oh, I really didn't mean that. He tried to walk it back. So to your question, that's a good question. I appreciate your input, whoever asked that question, because that's part of the problem these days is that The media has been attacked. And yeah, we're not perfect. But at CBS News, we try our darndest to get both sides of the story. And I think if you watch us day to day, night after night, you will see that. Both sides of the story.
Jeff, first we wanted to ask, are you still okay on time if we go a little bit longer?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't go anywhere in the pandemic, so we have time.
In Ohio. And we also wanted to remind the audience that if people have to bail to walk dogs or watch Thursday night football or what have you, there is a recording made of these sessions and it will be available. So if you do have to leave, but you want to see these last questions, they'll be available. If you want to review the tape, of course, you'll be able to see that too. So this is a question, I've been lucky over the years, Jeff, to get a lot of famous or at least successful, not all famous, Miami alums in front of our students through our traveling programs or bringing them back to campus. And again, something else I neglected when I introduced you is that for a number of years, my department, Media Journalism and Film, has had a distinguished alumni program where we invite 4 or 5 people back as distinguished alums. And Jeff had that honor a couple, 3 years ago, which says a lot about how we feel about Jeff. But one of the questions when we do get these successful alums back, Jeff, in front of our students is always to ask them, what are the things that happened in your life academically, extracurricularly at Miami that you believe were particularly meaningful to you in your personal life and your professional life?
Howard, you probably heard this story a million times, but Miami changed me. Before I went to Miami in high school, all I wanted to do was play football. I'm not some hulking guy. I'm 5'6.5", though I was 5'7" in the program. And I could run a 4.4, so I was fast. But the chances of me making it to the NFL were slim. But I wanted to prove people wrong, and so my focus was on playing football. And I loved Miami's history, the cradle of coaches, and the great players and coaches that have come through that program. And then it had great academics as well. And so I was looking for a nice balance. And I had a brother who was there, and that helped too. So Miami made me tougher. I was a kid from Connecticut. Okay, first of all, Connecticut is a soccer and lacrosse state, not football. But I wasn't as tough as maybe I should have been. And when I got to Miami, and I went as a walk-on, Coach Walker, who was the coach at the time, he toughened me up. He taught me about adversity. And how did he do that? Well, they would make us run in the heat of the day, in pads, until we got it right. Because he would say, the winners do the little things that the losers won't do. And as hard as that was, and you would see the biggest dudes on the team and the baddest dudes on the team, they'd be falling out and crying like babies. That's how hard it was. But it made us all tougher. And he taught me this lesson about adversity and how no matter who you are, where you come from, you're going to face some adversity in your life. How are you going to confront it? How are you going to handle it? Are you going to go into a shell? Cry? Are you going to get up, wipe yourself off, and keep on running? That was one of the messages that I got. So football at Miami shaped me to this day. I think about that all the time in my worst moments. And even though I've had what some people would consider a successful career, I've had some hard times, like everybody else. But you have to keep going. You have to keep pushing. And that's what Miami taught me. Also, Miami gave me direction. Because I was so focused on football, during my third year, I think, when I realized, oh, there's no way you're going to, I mean, you could go try out in Canada. Maybe you could try out as a free agent in the NFL. But, there's a really good chance that you'll just be a journeyman. And by the way, if college football hurts as much as, if pro football hurts as much as college football does, why would you want to do that to yourself? So at that point, I needed options. How am I going to pay these bills? And because I didn't have a clue, I was walking back to the dorm, and I saw this sign outside of Williams, auditions for the campus news station. And so I felt like, all right, I have nothing else to do. Let me walk in here. So I did the audition, and the professor says to me, hey, Jeff, I think you have a future in this business. And I said, really? And that's all it took. That's all it took was for him to believe in me, to encourage me. And the rest is history. After that, things started lining up. I went and begged for a job in Rockford, Illinois, and begged for a job in Dayton, Ohio, then begged for a job in Miami, Florida. No, excuse me, I missed one stop. I had to beg for a job in Milwaukee, essentially, beg for another job in Minneapolis, beg for a job in Miami, begged for a job in Baltimore, and then begged for a job in New York City. And then CBS, for some reason, they were the only ones who actually came after me. So it's been a long road. And the reason why I try to get back to Miami as much as I do is because Miami helped make this possible, along with my parents and their direction, along with my brother. But Miami is a big part of my life because it gave me the direction and the encouragement that I needed.
I know Michelle has a couple more questions from the audience before we finish up. So, Michelle.
Fantastic. So I always have trouble resisting a fun question. And so this is not going to count towards my couple, but we do have Frances Pegues, class of 1969, with us tonight. And Frances wants to know, is your family from South Carolina, Jeff?
My family is from Birmingham in Montgomery, Alabama. However, and I really need to do a search because I know that there are a lot of Pegueses in South Carolina. Now, here's the thing. You guys probably didn't know this. We are, my immediate four in my family, we're the only ones who call ourselves Pegues.
Oh, so
it's usually
Pegues.
Pegues. Okay, so here's a fun fact. My mother made my father change the pronunciation of his name because she wasn't comfortable with it. She thought it sounded like little piggies, so she didn't like it. And because he was so in love, and still is 50 plus years later, he changed the name to Pegues. And then there's that French influence. We believe that there is a French Portuguese origin to the name, and so over there they would have pronounced it Pegues. So we might be related to her question. We might be related. I mean, my family, my ancestors were on a plantation somewhere.
Yep.
So we might be related.
Francine, there's a chance, is what we're saying. All right. So for our last two questions, I pulled a couple that I think are looking ahead for what's to come. So let's do this one first. From Rusty Shuffleton, class of 2002. What do you think?
I know Rusty.
Yeah. What do you think President Trump's personal legal exposure will look like come January 2021?
Okay, I know Rusty. I think Rusty moved to New York. Hi, Rusty. And I did get the photograph you sent, by the way. I think he has some real issues. I think, again, because there's so much happening, people forget that he owes someone $400 million. Who is that person? What is that organization? Like, who does he owe that money to? That is a substantial amount of money. And so there are going to be some questions about that have to be answered, including how is he going to pay it back? And I think he still faces legal exposure in New York City with prosecutors there. You'll recall that when Michael Cohen was charged, the unnamed co-conspirator was President Trump. That was in the court documents. And there's all this talk about, well, could he pardon himself? Well, he could federally, but not with the state charges. So I think he knows that his life is going to be really different as soon as he leaves that White House. There are prosecutors in Washington, or excuse me, in New York City that are sort of licking their chops. And I think he knows that. So I think he's going to have a rough go of it. I mean, people are talking about a 2024 run. I think a lot of this stuff is going to come back to haunt him. The stuff that people don't want to believe, it's going to come back to haunt him. And then there was the other thing during the campaign that came out. Why did he have a bank account in China? It sounds crazy. It sounds weird. And even President Obama was joking about the fact that if he had a bank account in China, they'd be calling him Beijing Barry. But it's true. Like, how was that allowed to happen? Why didn't someone in his inner circle say, hey, Mr. President, we should close this account? What is this for? Why do you have an account in China? So there are questions around that account. So I think there's a lot there. And people criticize the media, but this is legitimate stuff. There's a reason why every president has to be vetted. You want to see their tax returns, because you want to know who they're tied to, who their allegiances are. And frankly, there you will see more questions about Joe Biden and his relationship with lobbyists. And that's a legitimate issue to cover. He has had a long relationship with lobbyists here in Washington. So these are important questions. And I think to Rusty's question, I think the president's going to have a tough time. And I don't think he's, everybody, I think most people get the message now that he's not just going to fade into the background. I mean, again, he got more than 71 million votes. He's probably going to start his own cable network. So we'll probably be seeing a lot of President Trump. But he will also face legal problems and financial problems. Because people also forget, and I know I'm going on, but people also forget there were a lot of banks that would not lend him money. And there's a reason for that.
2020 has certainly been an interesting year, and 2021 looks like it's not going to be boring either. So for our last question, this one is from Tom Davis, class of '83. What are the prospects for President-elect Biden to have meaningful compromise with Mitch McConnell and the Republican Senate, assuming the two runoff races in Georgia, Ossoff and Warnock, don't turn the Democrats' way?
I think even if the Democrats win the Senate seats in Georgia, a President Biden is going to have to he's going to have to be, as he said, and there's a reason why he's saying this, a president for all Americans. I think it's important that, just in terms of the unity of this country, these divisions have to heal. It's too much. It's too volatile. It's dangerous. And I think that's part of his appeal to people who voted for him, is that perhaps he's the one, because of his upbringing, because of his reputation, he's the one who can bring both sides together. The fact of the matter is, and we get so distracted by this, but it's so frustrating. For me, someone who just, watches these issues closely, we have this pandemic, 250,000 people have died. Unemployment is still high. People can't feed their families. And you have crime going up in certain places. Well, why do you think that's happening? It's because people are trying to survive. But we don't talk about that because there's so many other distractions going on. But that's really what's important here. And those people are both Republicans and Democrats, the people who are suffering the most. Okay, so this next president, if he wants to succeed, he has to find a way to bridge that gap. Despite what people to his left say, he has to find a way to be a moderate and to be a real moderate, and then leverage his relationships with people like Mitch McConnell. They have a history. Now, how does he use that? And then how does Mitch McConnell respond to that? Personally, and this isn't my area of expertise, of course, but I follow politics as closely as the next guy. I think it is in some ways, they might not see it this way, but in some ways it is to the Republicans' benefit to cooperate, to find common ground. Because there's just there are too many Americans right now who are suffering. And that's not the way it should be. I mean, last year, the economy was rocking, and all of a sudden the world changed. The bottom dropped out. And then you have members of Congress right now arguing about relief packages that people need. These are lives that they're talking about, but they forget. They look at them as numbers, and they're people. People in Ohio, people in Mississippi, people in South Carolina, Black, white, Asian, Latino, who are suffering. And there's got to be a better way than this ridiculous bickering. There's got to be a better way, which is why, I've sort of been racking my brain about, okay, what book do I want to do next? And I've settled on this idea. You guys tell me if it's a good one. I want to do a book on leadership. A book that talks about what it takes to be a good leader in this day and age. And again, for me, it goes back to my days playing football in Miami. Leaders stand up. Leaders have courage. Leaders tell you things that you don't want to hear, but it's the truth. Leaders lead by example. And I think for some reason we lack leadership in this country. You have to have courage to tell it like it is, or else these divisions will continue. And it does not help any American to have this level of division. I mean, people are actually talking about, in serious conversations, talking about a civil war. Are you kidding me? But that's the way people feel right now. Like the divisions run that deep that they can actually use that term in a sentence and people are actually believing that they mean it. So there has to be a way for this next president to bridge that gap.
Jeff, we could do this all night, but I think we need to let you go. We need to let our audience go. I just personally want to thank you. I said it when I introduced you that it's such a joy to watch, the career of students I had at Miami. And you, I don't want to embarrass you, but you embody everything that's good about Miami students. And the fact you've continued to give back to the university through your work with our program, being now on the board of trustees, the things like tonight, it's really heartening to see, that relationship with you and Miami continuing. So from my perspective, just thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you, Howard and Michelle. I appreciate you both. It's being in Washington, it always makes me feel good to reconnect with my friends in Miami. So thank you. And thank you all for the questions too. Tough questions. You can go easy on me.
They did not go easy on you. Well, Jeff, we can't thank you enough for sharing your time with the Miami family. You're always so generous with your time and your thoughts and your candor. And Howard, thank you so much for your dedication to the success of Miami students. I know you both have a lot of fans out there. And Jeff, I'm looking forward to reading that next book. So for everyone who's been watching from home tonight or wherever you were watching from, thanks for joining us. And thank you for the many thoughtful questions and comments that were submitted. I just wish we could have gotten to all of them. Please do be sure to check out all of our upcoming virtual events, including a virtual bourbon tasting tomorrow evening. I think we can all drink to that. And you can find us online at miamialum.org. Love and honor, everyone.
Bye.